The signs didn't appear all at once. They never do. At first, it was subtle, almost easy to ignore. A price cut here. A listing sitting a little longer than expected. An open house with fewer visitors than usual. Nothing alarming. Not yet. But beneath the surface, something had already shifted. Something structural. Something familiar. And for those who have studied housing cycles before, it felt eerily similar to moments in the past when everything changed. Because this isn't a story about a sudden crash. It's a story about how crashes begin. Quietly, unevenly, city by city. In 2008, the collapse didn't hit everywhere at the same time. It started in overheated markets, places where prices had stretched far beyond what local incomes could support. Places where speculation replaced stability. And today, in 2026, we are seeing the same pattern take shape again. But this time, it looks different on the surface. Stronger banks, tighter lending standards, more cautious buyers. So why are cracks appearing? The answer lies in a powerful combination of forces that have been building for years. First, interest rates. For over a decade, cheap money fueled one of the fastest housing expansions in modern history. Low rates made homes feel affordable, even when prices were climbing rapidly. Buyers stretched. Investors piled in. And prices kept rising. Then everything changed. Rates climbed sharply. Not gradually, but aggressively. And suddenly, affordability collapsed. Not because homes became more expensive overnight, but because borrowing did. A house that felt manageable at a 3% mortgage suddenly became unreachable at 7%. Monthly payments didn't just rise. They exploded. And when affordability disappears, demand doesn't just slow. It breaks. That's exactly what we are seeing now. Buyers are stepping back. Waiting. Hesitating. Walking away. Meanwhile, sellers are stuck in a different reality. Many still remember the peak. The bidding wars. The over-asking offers. And they price their homes based on what used to be true. But the market has already moved on. This gap between what sellers expect and what buyers can afford is where the pressure builds. And eventually, something gives. Now here, where it becomes more interesting. Because the crash doesn't happen everywhere equally. It starts in specific places. Predictable places. Cities where prices rose the fastest. Where investors dominated the market. Where migration trends suddenly reversed. These are the pressure points. The fault lines. And in 2026, those fault lines are beginning to crack. So the question becomes, which cities are first? Which markets are already showing signs of stress? Which ones are quietly leading the downturn before the rest of the country catches up? Let's begin. Number 10. Phoenix, Arizona. Just a few years ago, Phoenix was one of the hottest housing markets in the country. Prices surged at an astonishing pace. New developments stretched across the desert. Investors rushed in, betting on endless growth. For a moment, it felt unstoppable. But rapid growth comes with hidden risks. And Phoenix had several. First, a heavy reliance on migration. Many buyers weren't local. They were moving in from more expensive regions, bringing higher budgets with them. This created an artificial boost in demand. But migration isn't permanent. It shifts. And when it slows, demand weakens quickly. Second, investor activity. At the peak, a significant portion of homes were purchased not by families, but by investors. Short-term rentals, long-term rentals, speculative flips. That works well in a rising market. But in a slowing market, investors don't hold emotional attachment. They exit fast. Now, in 2026, Phoenix is showing early warning signs. Listings are rising. Price cuts are becoming more frequent. And homes are staying on the market longer than they did during the boom. Nothing dramatic yet, but the direction is clear. Number 9. Austin, Texas. Austin was once the symbol of the new housing boom. A tech-driven city, rapid population growth, a surge of high-income buyers. For years, prices climbed at a pace that seemed justified, even logical, until they didn't. Because at some point, growth outruns fundamentals. And Austin reached that point faster than most. Between 2020 and 2022, home prices in Austin surged dramatically. But incomes didn't keep up at the same rate. That imbalance matters, because housing markets ultimately depend on what people can afford, not just what they're willing to pay during a boom. Now in 2026, Austin is adjusting. And the adjustment isn't smooth. Inventory has increased. Sellers are competing more aggressively. And price reductions are no longer rare, they're expected. What makes Austin especially vulnerable isn't just its past growth. It's how fast sentiment is changing. In a hot market, buyers feel urgency. They rush. They compete. They stretch their budgets. But when the narrative shifts, that urgency disappears. And without urgency, prices struggle to hold. Number 8. Las Vegas, Nevada. Las Vegas has always been a boom and bust market. It's part of its identity. In the years leading up to 2008, Las Vegas experienced one of the most dramatic housing collapses in the country. Prices soared, then crashed even harder. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it often rhymes. And in 2026, some of those familiar patterns are re-emerging. Like Phoenix, Las Vegas saw strong investor activity during the recent boom. Like Phoenix, it benefited from migration. Unlike Phoenix, it's now facing a shift. Tourism-driven economies are also more sensitive to economic slowdowns. When uncertainty rises, discretionary spending falls. And that affects local stability. Housing markets don't exist in isolation. They reflect the strength or weakness of the broader economy. Right now, Las Vegas is showing signs of strain. More listings, fewer aggressive buyers, and a growing gap between asking prices and final sale prices. Small changes, but meaningful ones, because this is how it starts. Quietly. Number 7. Boise, Idaho. Boise was one of the most surprising success stories of the housing boom. A relatively small city that suddenly became a national hotspot. Remote work changed everything. People no longer needed to live near major urban centers. They looked for affordability, space, quality of life. Boise offered all of it. And demand surged. Prices followed. But rapid growth in smaller markets carries unique risks. Unlike large cities, smaller markets have less economic diversity, less resilience. And when demand slows, there are fewer layers of support. In Boise, prices rose faster than local incomes could justify. And now that imbalance is being corrected. In 2026, Boise is experiencing a noticeable cooling. Homes are sitting longer. Buyers are negotiating harder. And sellers are adjusting expectations. Not all at once, but steadily. And that steady shift is often more dangerous than a sudden drop, because it signals a deeper change, a change in direction. The shift is no longer theoretical. It's visible now, not in headlines, not in dramatic collapses, but in behavior. Buyers are slower, more cautious, more willing to walk away. Sellers, on the other hand, are beginning to feel something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. And uncertainty changes everything. Because housing markets are not driven by numbers alone. They are driven by psychology, by expectations, by belief. And when belief starts to crack, prices follow. As we move deeper into this list, the pattern becomes clearer. These are not random cities. They are connected by growth, by speculation, by imbalance, and now by early decline. Let's continue. Number 6. Tampa, Florida. For years, Tampa was one of the fastest-growing housing markets in the country. Warm weather, no state income tax, a steady flow of new residents. It became a magnet, not just for retirees, but for remote workers, investors, and out-of-state buyers. Demand surged. Construction followed. Prices climbed. But rapid expansion often hides underlying fragility. In Tampa, that fragility comes from two key pressures. First, supply. Builders responded aggressively to demand. New homes, new communities, new developments. At the peak, this was seen as a sign of strength. Now it's becoming a source of pressure. Because when demand slows, excess supply doesn't disappear. It lingers. Second, insurance and ownership costs. In recent years, the cost of owning a home in Florida has risen sharply. Insurance premiums, property taxes, maintenance. These aren't optional expenses. They are ongoing burdens. And when combined with higher mortgage rates, they push affordability even further out of reach. In 2026, Tampa is feeling the weight of both forces. More inventory, longer selling times, increasing price reductions. Nothing collapses overnight, but pressure builds. And in Tampa, that pressure is rising. Number 5. Nashville, Tennessee. Nashville was once considered one of the most stable growth markets in the country. A strong job market, cultural appeal, a steady influx of new residents. For years, it felt balanced, measured, sustainable, until the pace accelerated. During the housing boom, Nashville transformed. Investors entered the market in large numbers. Short-term rentals expanded rapidly. Neighborhoods changed almost overnight. And prices followed. But rapid transformation often comes with unintended consequences. In Nashville, affordability became a growing concern. Local buyers began to struggle. Prices moved faster than incomes. At first, this was masked by external demand. But as that demand slows, the imbalance becomes harder to ignore. In 2026, Nashville is entering a new phase. Investors are becoming more cautious. Short-term rental profitability is no longer guaranteed. And local buyers are more constrained than ever. This creates a vacuum, a space where demand weakens, but supply remains. And in that space, Prices begin to adjust. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but consistently. Number 4. Denver, Colorado. Denver's rise was built on a powerful combination of factors: economic growth, lifestyle appeal, and a steady stream of new residents. For years, it was one of the most desirable housing markets in the country. But desirability alone doesn't protect a market forever, because even the strongest markets have limits. In Denver, those limits were tested. Home prices climbed steadily for over a decade. But in the later stages of the boom, something changed. The pace accelerated. And when price growth accelerates beyond income growth, the foundation weakens. At the same time, borrowing costs increased sharply, and suddenly many potential buyers were priced out. Not gradually, but all at once. This is one of the most important turning points in any housing cycle. When affordability collapses quickly, demand doesn't have time to adjust. It disappears. In 2026, Denver is dealing with that reality. Fewer buyers, more hesitation, and a noticeable shift in market dynamics. Sellers are adjusting, but slowly, and that delay creates downward pressure, because markets don't wait for expectations to catch up. They move ahead. Number 3. Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta has long been considered a resilient housing market. Large, diverse, economically dynamic. But even resilient markets are not immune to cycles. During the recent housing boom, Atlanta experienced significant investor activity. Institutional buyers, large-scale rental portfolios, aggressive acquisitions. At one point, a substantial portion of home purchases came from investors. That kind of activity can push prices higher, faster than fundamentals alone would allow. But it also introduces a different kind of risk, because investors behave differently than traditional homeowners. They are not anchored by emotion. They are guided by returns. And when returns become uncertain, they adjust. In 2026, that adjustment is beginning. Rental yields are under pressure. Costs are rising. And appreciation is no longer guaranteed. This changes the equation. Investors become more selective. Some exit entirely. And when investor demand weakens, the market feels it. In Atlanta, early signs are emerging. More listings, more competition, and a subtle but important shift in pricing power. From sellers to buyers. Number 2. Salt Lake City, Utah. Salt Lake City experienced one of the most intense housing booms in the country, driven by strong population growth and limited supply. Prices surged rapidly. For a time, it seemed justified. But like many fast-growing markets, the pace eventually became unsustainable. Because housing markets are not just about growth. They are about balance. And when balance is lost, corrections follow. In Salt Lake City, affordability became a central issue. Prices rose quickly, but wages didn't keep up. At the same time, higher interest rates reduced purchasing power even further. This created a sharp shift. Buyers who once competed aggressively began to step back. Demand cooled, but supply continued to grow. This is where pressure intensifies. Because when supply rises into weakening demand, prices have only one direction to go. In 2026, Salt Lake City is approaching that point. Not in a dramatic collapse, but in a steady, persistent adjustment. The kind that reshapes a market over time and signals that something larger is unfolding. By now, the pattern is impossible to ignore. This isn't random. It isn't isolated. And it isn't temporary. Something deeper is unfolding. Across these cities, different in size, culture, and geography, the same signals are appearing. Demand weakening, supply building, expectations shifting. And when all three happen at once, the outcome becomes increasingly predictable. Because housing markets don't collapse in a single moment. They transition from strength to balance to weakness. And right now, many of these cities are crossing that invisible line. The line where sellers no longer control the market. The line where buyers gain leverage. The line where prices begin to fall. But before we reveal the final city, the one showing the clearest signs of early decline, we need to understand something even more important. Why this cycle feels different. After the 2008 housing collapse, the system changed. Lending standards tightened. Banks became more cautious. Risk was reduced. And for years, that created a sense of stability. A belief that the next crash, if it ever came, would be less severe, more controlled. And in some ways, that belief is true. This is not 2008. There is no widespread subprime lending crisis. No immediate wave of forced foreclosures. But that doesn't mean there isn't risk. Because this cycle is driven by something else. Affordability. In many of the cities we've discussed, home prices rose faster than incomes for years. At the same time, borrowing costs increased sharply. This created a new kind of pressure. Not from bad loans, but from mathematical limits. There is a point where buyers simply cannot afford to participate. Not because they don't want to, but because they can't. And when enough buyers reach that point, the market shifts. Quietly at first, then all at once. For years, sellers held the advantage. They set the price. They controlled the terms. They chose the buyer. But in 2026, that power is beginning to move toward the buyer. You can see it in the data. But more importantly, you can feel it in behavior. Buyers are negotiating again, requesting concessions, walking away from deals. These were rare during the boom. Now, they're becoming normal. And when buyer behavior changes, price direction follows. Because at its core, the housing market is simple. Prices rise when buyers compete. Prices fall when they don't. So what happens when competition disappears? We are starting to find out. Number 1. San Francisco, California. For years, San Francisco represented the peak of housing demand. A global tech hub. High incomes. Limited supply. It wasn't just a strong market. It was the market. Prices reached levels that seemed almost untouchable. And for a long time, they were. But even the strongest markets have vulnerabilities. And in San Francisco, those vulnerabilities have been building quietly. First, remote work. The very innovation that helped fuel the city's growth also changed its future. Workers no longer needed to live near the office. They had options, and many chose to leave. Second, affordability. Even before interest rates rose, San Francisco was one of the least affordable housing markets in the country. When rates increased, that affordability challenge became extreme. The pool of potential buyers shrank dramatically. Third, demand concentration. San Francisco's housing market has always depended heavily on a specific segment: high-income tech workers. When that sector slows, the impact is amplified. In 2026, all of these forces are converging. Demand is softer, listings are increasing, and price reductions are becoming more common. Not in a sudden collapse, but in a steady, undeniable trend. And because San Francisco sits at the top of the pricing spectrum, even small percentage declines represent significant value losses. This is what makes it so important. Because historically, what happens in markets like San Francisco doesn't stay there. It spreads, not immediately, not evenly, but gradually, from high-cost cities to mid-tier markets to smaller regions. A ripple effect. And that ripple may already be in motion. So what does all of this mean? Are we heading toward a full-scale housing crash? Or just a correction? The answer isn't simple. Because housing markets are complex. They respond to multiple forces at once. But one thing is clear. The conditions that supported rapid price growth have changed. Cheap money is gone. Unlimited demand is gone. The sense of urgency is fading. And in its place, a new reality is emerging. One defined by caution, by negotiation, by restraint. This doesn't mean every city will crash. It doesn't mean prices will fall everywhere. But it does mean something important. The era of easy gains in housing is over. And for the cities we've explored, the adjustment has already begun. By the time most people recognize a housing downturn, it's already well underway. Not because the data wasn't there, not because the signs were invisible, but because the shift didn't feel dramatic enough at first. No sudden collapse, no overnight panic, no single moment that clearly marked the beginning. Just a series of small changes. A price reduced, a deal that falls through, a listing that sits and sits and sits. Individually, these moments seem insignificant. But together, they tell a different story. A story of transition. From expansion, to hesitation, to contraction. And by 2026, that transition is no longer subtle. It's measurable. Across the cities we've explored. Phoenix, Austin, Las Vegas, Boise, Tampa, Nashville, Denver, Atlanta, Salt Lake City, San Francisco. Different markets, different dynamics, but the same underlying shift. Demand is no longer keeping up. And when demand weakens, everything else begins to follow. This is the question everyone eventually asks. Is this the beginning of something larger, or simply a temporary pause? The answer depends on what happens next. Not just in housing, but in the broader economy. Because housing does not exist in isolation. It responds to employment, to income growth, to interest rates, to confidence. If rates remain high, affordability will stay constrained. If economic uncertainty increases, Buyers will remain cautious. And if supply continues to build, prices will face sustained pressure. But there's another factor, one that is often overlooked. Time. Housing markets don't adjust overnight. They move in phases. First, demand slows. Then inventory rises. Then prices begin to soften. And finally, the broader public takes notice. We are somewhere in the middle of that process now. Not at the beginning, not at the end, but in the phase where the direction is becoming clear. Even if the outcome is not fully realized. Perhaps the most powerful force in housing isn't economic. It's psychological. During the boom, people believed prices would keep rising. That belief drove behavior. It created urgency, competition, momentum. But in a shifting market, belief changes. Buyers begin to wait, to question, to hesitate. And hesitation is powerful. Because when buyers hesitate, sellers lose leverage. And when sellers lose leverage, prices adjust. Not because they want to, but because they have to. This is the moment we are entering. A moment where expectations are being rewritten. Where the narrative is changing. From certainty to caution. For years, the housing market felt unstoppable. Even inevitable. Prices rose through uncertainty. Through global disruption. Through shifting economic conditions. It created a sense that housing, especially in high-demand cities, was untouchable. But no market is untouchable. Every cycle has limits. Every trend has an end point. And what we are witnessing in 2026 is not the collapse of housing, but the end of an era. An era defined by rapid growth, easy money, and relentless demand. What comes next is something different, more measured, more selective, more uncertain. So where does that leave us? With a clearer understanding of what's happening and what might come next. The cities we've explored are not random. They are signals, early indicators of a broader shift, one that may take years to fully unfold. They show us how housing markets change. Not suddenly, but gradually. Not everywhere, but in specific places first. And most importantly, they remind us of something fundamental. That markets are not controlled by headlines, or predictions, or even past performance. They are shaped by forces that evolve, quietly, until they can no longer be ignored. The 2026 housing shift is not defined by a single crash. It is defined by a pattern of weakening demand, rising supply, unchanging expectations. And once that pattern begins, it tends to continue, not because of fear, but because of structure, because of the way housing markets work. The crash doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself, slowly, unevenly, city by city. And by the time the world finally sees it clearly, it's already in motion.